There is a democracy that operates beyond the ballot box, one that includes voices from centuries past in our present deliberations. This is not mysticism but practical wisdom, what I call the democracy of the dead. When we make political decisions guided solely by contemporary opinion polls and expert studies, we exclude the accumulated experience of generations who faced similar challenges and learned hard-won lessons about human nature and political life. The living constitute a small minority compared to those who have gone before us. Yet modern rationalism insists we ignore this vast repository of tested wisdom. Consider how we approach governance today. We consult economists about prosperity, sociologists about community, and political scientists about democracy, but we rarely ask what our ancestors discovered through centuries of trial and error about these same eternal questions. This exclusion of the dead from our political conversation represents not progress but impoverishment, a dangerous narrowing of human wisdom precisely when we need it most. The secret I wish to share is that genuine democracy has always included the dead as active participants in political life. Chapter 1: The Voices We've Silenced. Modern democracy operates on a curious premise, that political wisdom began with our generation. We've created what amounts to an apartheid against the past, systematically excluding the voices of those who built the institutions we've inherited, who faced crises we think are unprecedented, who discovered through bitter experience what works and what leads to disaster. This temporal chauvinism reflects the rationalist conceit that each generation starts fresh, armed with superior knowledge and freed from the superstitions of the past. But consider what we lose in this exclusion. When we debate the proper limits of government power, we ignore the warnings of those who lived through the rise and fall of empires. When we discuss the relationship between freedom and order, we dismiss the insights of those who navigated the delicate balance between anarchy and tyranny. When we consider economic policies, we overlook the experiences of generations who witnessed the human cost of various experiments in social organization. The democracy of the dead operates differently. It recognizes that political problems are not technical puzzles awaiting expert solutions but enduring aspects of the human condition that each generation must navigate anew. The dead speak to us not through mystical communication but through the institutions they created, the practices they refined, the constitutional arrangements they bequeathed to us. Their vote is cast not in elections but in the continuing vitality of the traditions they shaped through centuries of accumulated experience. This is not ancestor worship but practical recognition that political wisdom emerges gradually through the interaction of countless minds across generations. No single generation possesses sufficient experience to solve the fundamental challenges of human association. We need the democracy of the dead not because the past was perfect but because it was extensive, offering a broader sample of human experience than any contemporary survey could provide. The silencing of these voices began with the Enlightenment's confidence that reason could replace tradition as the guide to political life. This rationalist revolution promised to liberate humanity from the alleged prejudices of the past, creating political arrangements based on scientific principles rather than inherited customs. But this liberation came at a cost: the loss of accumulated wisdom about human nature, political institutions, and the delicate conditions necessary for civilized life. Consider how this plays out in contemporary policy debates. When experts propose comprehensive healthcare reforms, they rarely consult the extensive historical record of previous attempts at government-managed medicine. When urban planners design new communities, they dismiss traditional neighborhood patterns as outdated, despite centuries of evidence about what creates livable environments. When educators reform curricula, they abandon time-tested approaches in favor of theories that lack the validation of extended experience. The result is a peculiar form of democratic impoverishment. We have universal suffrage for the living but systematic disenfranchisement of the dead. This creates policies based on the limited experience of a single generation rather than the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who faced similar challenges. We've traded the democracy of tested experience for the tyranny of contemporary opinion. Chapter 2: How Tradition Votes in Democracy. Tradition participates in democratic life not as a static force resisting change but as a dynamic conversation partner contributing accumulated wisdom to contemporary deliberations. When we face political choices, tradition votes through the constitutional arrangements that channel our decisions, the legal precedents that guide our judgments, the cultural expectations that shape our behavior. This is democracy's secret strength. It includes not just the preferences of the living but the tested experience of the dead. Consider how the American Constitution embodies this principle. The framers created institutions designed to slow political decision-making, to require broad consensus, to prevent hasty action based on temporary majorities. These arrangements represent the democratic participation of previous generations who learned through experience the dangers of unchecked popular will. When contemporary majorities find themselves frustrated by constitutional limitations, they encounter the votes of the dead, the accumulated wisdom of those who discovered that democracy requires institutional safeguards to survive. The same principle operates in common law, where judges apply precedents developed through centuries of legal experience. Each legal decision represents not just contemporary judgment but the participation of countless previous decisions in ongoing legal conversation. The democracy of the dead prevents each generation from starting legal reasoning from scratch, providing continuity and accumulated wisdom that purely contemporary decision-making cannot achieve. Even in economic life, traditional practices embody the democratic participation of the dead. Market institutions evolved through centuries of human cooperation and competition, encoding the lessons learned by countless previous generations about exchange, property, and economic organization. When rationalist planners proposed to redesign economic systems from first principles, they effectively disenfranchised this accumulated experience, replacing the democracy of the dead with the dictatorship of contemporary theory. The genius of democracy lies not in its ability to register contemporary preferences but in its capacity to include the tested wisdom of the past in present deliberations. This requires institutions that can transmit accumulated experience across generations, cultural practices that preserve hard-won insights, educational approaches that introduce each generation to the great conversation of human experience that preceded them. But how exactly does tradition cast its vote? Through multiple channels that operate simultaneously in democratic societies. Constitutional frameworks create the procedural context within which contemporary decisions must be made. These frameworks embody the accumulated wisdom of previous generations about how to structure political authority, limit governmental power, and protect individual rights. When contemporary politicians find themselves constrained by constitutional requirements, they experience the democratic participation of the founding generation and all subsequent generations who maintain these arrangements. Cultural traditions also participate democratically through the formation of citizen character and expectations. Democratic citizenship requires certain virtues: prudence, moderation, civic responsibility, tolerance for disagreement, that cannot be manufactured by contemporary institutions alone. These virtues develop through cultural transmission across generations, as parents, teachers, and community leaders pass down inherited wisdom about how to participate constructively in democratic life. When citizens act with democratic civility, they embody the votes of countless previous generations who learned through experience what democracy requires to flourish. Professional traditions similarly enable the democratic participation of accumulated expertise. Legal reasoning draws upon centuries of judicial experience encoded in precedents and professional practices. Medical practice incorporates accumulated clinical wisdom transmitted through professional education and mentorship. Scientific inquiry builds upon generations of previous research and methodological refinement. These traditions allow contemporary practitioners to benefit from far more experience than any individual could accumulate in a single lifetime, representing a form of democratic participation by previous generations of practitioners. Chapter 3: The Arrogance of the Present Generation. Each generation faces the temptation to believe it has finally achieved political enlightenment, that its perspectives represent the culmination of human progress, that previous generations were simply less informed versions of itself. This temporal arrogance manifests itself in the rationalist assumption that political problems can be solved through the application of contemporary knowledge, freed from the alleged prejudices and limitations of the past. Yet observe how consistently this arrogance leads to political disaster. The French revolutionaries believed they could redesign society according to rational principles, dismissing centuries of accumulated political experience as mere superstition. The result was not enlightened governance but terror, instability, and eventual dictatorship. The Soviet planners thought they could organize economic life according to scientific principles, rejecting traditional market institutions as inefficient relics. The outcome was not prosperity but scarcity, oppression, and economic collapse. The pattern repeats in less dramatic but equally instructive ways. Contemporary urban planners design communities according to rationalist principles, dismissing traditional neighborhood patterns as outdated, only to create sterile environments that fail to support human flourishing. Educational reformers redesign curricula according to progressive theories, abandoning traditional liberal arts as irrelevant, only to produce graduates unprepared for thoughtful citizenship. Policy experts propose comprehensive solutions to social problems, ignoring the accumulated wisdom embedded in traditional practices, only to create unintended consequences that require further expert intervention. The arrogance of the present generation stems from confusing information with wisdom, technique with understanding, innovation with improvement. Contemporary society has unprecedented access to data, analysis, and expert opinion, but this abundance of information often obscures rather than illuminates the enduring questions of political life. The dead cannot provide us with contemporary data, but they offer something more valuable, the wisdom that emerges from long experience with the permanent challenges of human association. This arrogance reveals itself in the language we use to discuss political change. We speak of modernization as if temporal newness guaranteed improvement. We praise cutting-edge solutions as if the metaphor of a blade cutting through complexity captured the nature of political wisdom. We criticize backward-looking approaches as if learning from experience represented intellectual failure rather than practical prudence. The temporal chauvinism of contemporary political discourse assumes that each generation starts with a clean slate, that accumulated tradition represents mere historical accident rather than tested wisdom, that innovative approaches are inherently superior to inherited practices. This assumption underlies most contemporary policy debates, where the burden of proof falls on defenders of traditional arrangements rather than advocates of untested innovations. Consider how this plays out in discussions of constitutional interpretation. Originalists who argue for understanding constitutional text according to historical meaning are dismissed as antiquarians, while advocates of living constitution interpretation present themselves as progressive and enlightened. But which approach actually shows greater respect for democratic wisdom? The originalist position includes the constitutional wisdom of founding generations in contemporary legal interpretation, while the living constitution approach effectively disenfranchises the dead in favor of contemporary judicial preferences. The same pattern appears in educational debates. Defenders of traditional liberal arts curricula are characterized as resistant to change, while advocates of contemporary studies programs present themselves as forward-thinking and relevant. But which approach actually provides students with broader democratic participation in human experience? Traditional curricula include students in the great conversation of human civilization, while contemporary approaches limit them to the perspectives of their own historical moment. Recognizing our limitations requires intellectual humility, the acknowledgement that political wisdom accumulates gradually through the experience of many generations, that no single cohort possesses sufficient knowledge to redesign human institutions from scratch, that the democracy of the dead offers essential guidance for navigating the eternal challenges of political life. Chapter 4: What the Dead Know About Freedom. The dead have much to teach us about freedom because they experienced its loss, witnessed its fragility, and learned through bitter experience the conditions necessary for its preservation. Contemporary discussions of freedom often treat it as a natural condition that emerges automatically in the absence of obvious constraints. But the dead know better. They understand that freedom is an achievement, not a default state, requiring careful cultivation and institutional protection across generations. Consider what the dead discovered about the relationship between freedom and law. Modern rationalism often presents law as a limitation on freedom, a necessary evil that constrains natural liberty for social purposes. But the accumulated experience of generations reveals a different truth. Properly conceived law creates the conditions within which freedom can flourish. The dead learned that without reliable legal frameworks, human freedom dissolves into the chaos of competing wills, where only the strongest can act according to their preferences. The dead also understand the paradox of democratic freedom, that majority rule, if unconstrained, can destroy the very liberty it claims to serve. Through centuries of political experience, previous generations discovered the necessity of constitutional limitations, separation of powers, and protected rights that prevent democratic majorities from tyrannizing minorities. These institutional arrangements embody the democratic participation of the dead in protecting freedom from its own excesses. Educational freedom provides another example of wisdom transmitted across generations. The dead learned that genuine intellectual freedom requires not the absence of constraints but immersion in inherited traditions of learning. Liberal education, as it developed through centuries of university life, recognized that students achieve intellectual freedom not by starting fresh but by engaging seriously with the accumulated wisdom of human civilization. The freedom to think originally emerges from deep familiarity with how others have thought before us. Economic freedom similarly reveals the wisdom of the dead. Traditional market institutions evolved through centuries of human cooperation, encoding hard-won lessons about property rights, voluntary exchange, and the spontaneous coordination of human activity. When contemporary planners propose to improve upon these inherited arrangements through rational design, they often destroy the delicate conditions that make economic freedom possible. The democracy of the dead protects freedom by transmitting across generations the accumulated knowledge of how liberty can be preserved. This is not the preservation of ancient privileges but the conservation of tested wisdom about the institutional and cultural conditions that allow human freedom to flourish across time. The dead understood that freedom exists not in isolation but within relationships, legal, cultural, economic, and political relationships that create the context within which individual liberty becomes possible. They learned that attempts to maximize freedom by eliminating all constraints typically result in the destruction of the conditions that make freedom meaningful. True freedom requires what the dead discovered through experience: institutions that channel human energy constructively, traditions that cultivate appropriate character, and customs that enable cooperative action without coercive coordination. Consider the American founding generation's understanding of religious freedom. They learned from centuries of European religious warfare that freedom of conscience required not the elimination of religion from public life but institutional arrangements that prevented any single religious tradition from dominating others. The Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment embody this accumulated wisdom about how to protect religious freedom through constitutional design rather than secularist exclusion. The dead also learned about the relationship between economic freedom and social stability. Market economies developed gradually through centuries of commercial practice, creating institutions, property rights, contract law, Commercial customs that enable voluntary exchange while maintaining social cohesion. When contemporary theorists propose to improve market outcomes through comprehensive planning, they risk destroying the delicate institutional ecology that makes both economic freedom and social cooperation possible. Political freedom reveals the same pattern. The dead learn that democratic self-government requires not just electoral procedures but cultural traditions that cultivate civic virtue, educational practices that prepare citizens for responsible participation, and constitutional arrangements that protect minority rights against majority tyranny. These discoveries emerged gradually through centuries of political experience and cannot be replicated through rational design alone. Chapter 5: Why the Living Need the Dead. The living generation, despite its access to unprecedented information and analytical tools, suffers from a crucial limitation: insufficient experience with the full range of human possibilities. We can observe contemporary societies, analyze current trends, and project future developments, but we cannot personally experience the rise and fall of empires, the long-term consequences of political innovations, or the cyclical patterns that become visible only across centuries. This is why we need the democracy of the dead, not as masters but as advisors who have witnessed what we cannot see. Democracy requires more than contemporary consent. It needs the tested wisdom that emerges from long experience with the challenges of self-government. The dead offer this wisdom not through mystical communication but through the institutions they refined, the practices they developed, the constitutional arrangements they bequeathed to us. When we participate in democratic life, we join a conversation that began long before our birth and will continue long after our death. Consider how this works in practical terms. When American citizens participate in elections, they operate within institutional frameworks shaped by centuries of democratic experience. The two-party system, the electoral college, the separation of powers, these arrangements embody the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned through trial and error how to make democratic governance stable and effective. Contemporary voters participate not just in immediate political choices but in ongoing democratic traditions that connect them to the experience of the dead. The same principle applies to education. When we introduce young people to literature, history, and philosophy, we include them in the great conversation of human civilization. Students learn not just contemporary perspectives but the accumulated wisdom of those who grappled with enduring questions across centuries. This educational inheritance enables each generation to build upon rather than repeat the discoveries of the past. Professional practices similarly embody the democratic participation of the dead. Legal reasoning draws upon centuries of judicial experience. Medical practice incorporates accumulated clinical wisdom. Scientific inquiry builds upon generations of previous research. These traditions allow practitioners to benefit from far more experience than any individual could accumulate in a single lifetime. The living need the dead because political wisdom requires the kind of extensive experience that only accumulates across generations. No contemporary analysis, however sophisticated, can substitute for the tested insights that emerge from centuries of human experience with the permanent challenges of political life. But why do the living resist this inheritance? Partly because contemporary education emphasizes innovation over tradition, change over continuity, novelty over tested practice. Students learn to critique inherited arrangements rather than to understand why they developed as they did. This creates citizens who are skilled at identifying problems in traditional practices but lack the historical perspective necessary to understand why these practices emerged and what functions they serve. The resistance also stems from the democratic conceit that contemporary majorities should determine all political arrangements. If we truly believe in democratic equality, why should the preferences of the dead override the choices of the living? This objection misunderstands both democracy and tradition. Democratic institutions work best when they include not just contemporary preferences but accumulated wisdom about how to make democratic choice-making stable and effective. The dead participate not as dictators but as advisors whose experience can inform contemporary deliberation. Contemporary society faces challenges that appear unprecedented but actually represent variations on enduring themes. Economic inequality, political polarization, cultural fragmentation, educational decline, these problems have appeared in different forms throughout human history. The dead cannot provide specific solutions to contemporary versions of these challenges, but they can offer insights about what approaches have proven effective or counterproductive in addressing similar problems. The democracy of the dead operates through multiple channels: constitutional frameworks that embody accumulated wisdom about political organization, legal traditions that preserve tested approaches to justice, educational institutions that transmit cultural inheritance, professional practices that incorporate accumulated expertise, social customs that encode lessons about human cooperation. These channels enable the living to benefit from far more experience than any single generation could provide. The living need the dead not because the past was superior to the present but because political wisdom emerges gradually through extensive experience with the enduring challenges of human association. Each generation faces these challenges in new circumstances, but the fundamental problems remain constant: how to organize political authority, how to balance freedom with order, how to cultivate civic virtue, how to maintain social cohesion amid diversity. The dead offer tested approaches to these permanent challenges, not as final solutions but as starting points for contemporary reflection. Chapter 6: The Rationalist Exclusion of the Past. Contemporary rationalism operates on the assumption that political problems can be solved through the application of expert knowledge and scientific method, making the accumulated experience of previous generations not just irrelevant but potentially harmful to clear thinking. This represents a systematic exclusion of the dead from political deliberation, replacing the democracy of inherited wisdom with the technocracy of contemporary expertise. The rationalist approach treats political challenges as technical problems awaiting expert solutions. Urban planning becomes a matter of applying sociological research and architectural theory. Economic policy becomes the domain of trained economists armed with sophisticated models. Educational reform becomes the application of pedagogical science and psychological research. In each case, the accumulated wisdom of previous generations is dismissed as unscientific prejudice that obscures rather than illuminates proper solutions. This exclusion manifests itself in the language of political discourse. We speak of evidence-based policy as if only contemporary research counts as evidence, ignoring the extensive evidence provided by centuries of political experience. We praise innovative approaches as if novelty were inherently superior to tested practices. We criticize traditional methods as if accumulated wisdom were merely outdated superstition awaiting replacement by expert knowledge. The consequences of this exclusion are visible throughout modern political life. Urban renewal projects designed according to rationalist principles destroyed functioning neighborhoods that had evolved organically over generations. Educational reforms based on progressive theory abandoned traditional liberal arts curricula that had successfully transmitted cultural inheritance for centuries. Economic policies designed by expert planners repeatedly produce unintended consequences that traditional market institutions would have avoided. The rationalist exclusion of the past rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of political knowledge. It assumes that political understanding can be reduced to technical expertise, that complex human institutions can be improved through rational design, that accumulated tradition represents mere historical accident rather than tested wisdom. This approach not only impoverishes political deliberation but also makes it more likely to produce policies that fail because they ignore the hard-won lessons of human experience. Recovering the democracy of the dead requires challenging this rationalist assumption, recognizing that political wisdom accumulates gradually through the experience of many generations, and creating institutional arrangements that can transmit this accumulated knowledge to contemporary decision-makers. The rationalist exclusion operates through several mechanisms that systematically marginalize traditional wisdom. Academic specialization creates experts who know contemporary research in narrow fields but lack historical perspective on how previous generations addressed similar challenges. Professional education emphasizes technical skills and current best practices while neglecting the accumulated wisdom of professional traditions. Policy analysis focuses on quantitative data and statistical models while dismissing qualitative insights derived from historical experience. Government bureaucracies embody this rationalist approach by organizing themselves around functional specialization rather than accumulated wisdom. Departments of education are staffed by people trained in contemporary pedagogical theory rather than educators steeped in traditional approaches to learning. Economic agencies employ economists trained in mathematical modeling rather than practitioners familiar with the historical development of market institutions. Social service agencies hire social workers trained in current therapeutic techniques rather than people experienced in traditional approaches to community support. The media reinforces this exclusion by treating political questions as technical problems requiring expert analysis rather than enduring challenges requiring wisdom derived from experience. News coverage focuses on polling data, economic indicators, and expert opinions while rarely consulting historical precedents or traditional practices. Political commentary emphasizes innovation and reform while treating continuity and tradition as signs of stagnation rather than stability. Even conservative political movements often accept the rationalist framework while simply advocating different technical solutions. Instead of defending traditional institutions because they embody accumulated wisdom, conservatives argue for traditional policies because they produce better outcomes according to contemporary measures. This approach concedes the rationalist assumption that political arrangements should be judged by their technical effectiveness rather than their conformity to inherited wisdom. The result is a political culture that systematically excludes the democracy of the dead from contemporary deliberation. Policy debates become contests between competing technical expertise rather than conversations that include the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. Political education becomes training in analytical techniques rather than initiation into inherited traditions of citizenship. Democratic participation becomes the exercise of contemporary preferences rather than participation in ongoing conversations that connect the living with the dead. Chapter 7: Restoring the Great Conversation. The democracy of the dead can be restored not through nostalgia but through practical recognition that political wisdom requires conversation between generations. This means creating educational institutions that introduce students to the accumulated wisdom of human civilization, political institutions that incorporate traditional practices alongside contemporary innovations, and cultural practices that maintain living connections to inherited wisdom. Educational reform offers the most direct path to restoring this conversation. Liberal education, properly conceived, introduces students to the great conversation of human civilization, enabling them to participate as informed citizens in ongoing political life. This requires curricula that include not just contemporary perspectives but the accumulated wisdom of those who grappled with enduring questions across centuries. Students should encounter the political insights of ancient philosophers, the constitutional wisdom of founding generations, the literary explorations of human nature developed across cultures and centuries. Political institutions can also be reformed to include the voices of the dead more effectively. This might involve constitutional arrangements that require consideration of traditional practices before implementing radical innovations, judicial procedures that give greater weight to accumulated precedent, legislative processes that carefully examine the historical experience with proposed policies. The goal is not to prevent all change but to ensure that innovation builds upon rather than dismisses accumulated wisdom. Cultural institutions play a crucial role in maintaining the democracy of the dead. Museums, libraries, historical societies, and cultural organizations preserve and transmit the accumulated achievements of human civilization. These institutions enable contemporary society to maintain living connections to inherited wisdom, ensuring that the voices of the dead continue to participate in ongoing cultural conversation. The restoration of this great conversation requires recognizing that democracy means more than contemporary majority rule. It means the ongoing participation of human wisdom across generations in the perpetual challenges of political life. This is not ancestor worship but practical recognition that political understanding emerges gradually through extensive experience with the enduring problems of human association. Contemporary America faces the choice between the democracy of the dead and the dictatorship of contemporary expertise. The former offers the accumulated wisdom of centuries of political experience. The latter provides only the limited perspective of a single generation convinced of its own enlightenment. The choice will determine whether American democracy continues to benefit from inherited wisdom or abandons this legacy in favor of rationalist innovation. But how specifically can this restoration occur? Educational institutions must recover their role as transmitters of cultural inheritance rather than producers of contemporary relevance. Universities should require students to engage seriously with the great works of human civilization, not as museum pieces but as living voices in ongoing conversation about enduring questions. This means reading Aristotle on politics, Aquinas on law, Burke on tradition, and the American founders on constitutional government, not as historical curiosities but as conversation partners who offer insights relevant to contemporary challenges. Professional education also needs reform to include traditional wisdom alongside contemporary techniques. Law schools should emphasize the accumulated wisdom of legal tradition rather than focusing exclusively on current doctrine and innovative legal theories. Medical schools should include the classical understanding of medicine as a healing art rather than treating it purely as applied biological science. Business schools should teach the ethical traditions of commercial life rather than focusing exclusively on management techniques and financial analysis. Political institutions themselves must be reformed to give greater voice to traditional wisdom. This might involve creating institutional roles for people specifically charged with representing traditional perspectives in policy debates. Legislative bodies could include positions similar to the British House of Lords, where experience and traditional wisdom receive institutional representation alongside contemporary democratic choice. Judicial appointment processes could give greater weight to candidates steeped in legal tradition rather than focusing exclusively on technical expertise and contemporary judicial philosophy. Cultural institutions need increased support and reformed missions to serve as effective transmitters of inherited wisdom. Public libraries should emphasize their role as repositories of human civilization rather than focusing exclusively on contemporary information services. Museums should present historical artifacts as embodiments of living traditions rather than curiosities from dead cultures. Historical societies should engage actively in contemporary debates by demonstrating the relevance of historical experience to current challenges. The restoration requires citizens who understand themselves as participants in ongoing conversation rather than as autonomous individuals making choices in historical vacuum. This means cultivating a sense of obligation to inherited wisdom alongside commitment to contemporary democracy. Citizens should see themselves as temporary stewards of inherited institutions rather than as sovereign creators of political arrangements. Democratic participation should include respectful consideration of traditional practices alongside critical evaluation of contemporary alternatives. Conclusion. The democracy of the dead offers contemporary political life something irreplaceable: the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced similar challenges and learned hard-won lessons about human nature and political association. This is not mysticism but practical recognition that political understanding emerges gradually through extensive experience with the enduring problems of human life. When we exclude the voices of the dead from our political deliberations, we impoverish our capacity for wise judgment and make ourselves vulnerable to the kinds of errors that accumulated experience helps us avoid. The choice before us is clear: we can continue the great conversation of human civilization, benefiting from the tested insights of those who came before us, or we can abandon this inheritance in favor of the limited perspective of contemporary expertise. The former path leads to political wisdom, the latter to the repetition of ancient errors in modern forms. Democracy's secret strength lies not in its ability to register contemporary preferences but in its capacity to include the tested wisdom of the dead in present deliberations. This is the democracy that truly serves human flourishing, one that honors both the living and the dead as participants in the ongoing project of civilized life.